I need to check the use names list and then write the story. The band names include Dorothy, Marcus, Brianna, Robert, Patricia, Nathan, Cassandra, Gerald, Evelyn, Leonard, Oliver, Vanessa, Helen, Suzanne, Thomas, June, Margaret, Walter, Mitchell, Renata, Cecilia, Harmon, Philip, Adrian, Claudette, Aaron, Lydia, Francis, Beverly, Calvin, Renee, Samuel, Connor, Connie, Judith, Eleanor, Derek, Shauna, Paula, Garrett, Tiffany, Harold, Iris Calloway, Kyle, Diana, Nora, Winifred Oakes, Terrence, Sandra, Vera, Rose, Ryan, Melissa, Constance, Brandon, Stephanie, Gordon, Kevin, Priya, Diane, Colin, Serena, Lorraine, Harriet Lowe, Warren, Yunette, Marianne, Louis, Renee, Charles, Gloria, Trevor, Nadine, Patty, Elaine, Fletcher, Arthur, Donovan, Tara, Margot, Ruthann, Betty, Fiona, Martin, Lily, Owen, Noel, Wanda, Celeste, Edmund, Sandra, Patrick, Christy, Rosemary, Benji, Virginia, Tamara, Craig, Barbara. New names I'll use: Audrey, narrator/mother, 63, Julian, son-in-law, Claire, daughter, Richard, late husband, Sylvia, Julian's mother, Frank, loyal employee. I never imagined I would be standing in the lobby of the company I built from nothing, watching a security guard escort my own son-in-law to his new office, the one with the mop closet next to it. But that morning, as I watched Julian walk past me without meeting my eyes, I thought about how we got here. And I thought about the night of my daughter's birthday dinner 8 months earlier, when everything changed. Let me start from the beginning. My husband Richard died on a Tuesday in March 17 years ago. He was 51 years old, and he left behind a small commercial printing business with 4 employees, a building we were still paying off, and more debt than I want to remember. He also left behind me, 63 now, but 46 then, and our daughter Claire, who was 22 and had just started her first real job at a marketing firm downtown. I won't pretend those first 2 years were anything other than survival. I didn't know the printing business. Richard had handled everything: the contracts, the equipment, the vendor relationships. I knew how to keep the books because I had always done that part. But running operations was a different world entirely. I made mistakes that cost us money we didn't have. I lost 2 clients in the first 6 months because I didn't understand the production timelines well enough to promise what we could actually deliver. But I also learned, faster than I expected, honestly. There's something that happens to a woman when she has no other choice. You either figure it out or you lose everything, and losing everything was not something I was willing to do. Not the business Richard spent 20 years building. Not the retirement we had barely started saving for. Not the house Claire grew up in. By the time Claire was 25, the business had stabilized. By the time she was 28, we had grown from 4 employees to 19. And I had signed our first contract with a regional grocery chain for their weekly promotional materials. That contract alone changed everything. It gave us predictable volume, steady cash flow, and enough credibility to go after bigger clients. I was proud of what I had built. I am still proud of it. I want to say that clearly before I tell you the rest. Claire met Julian at a conference. He was in sales for a packaging company, charming, well-dressed, quick with a compliment. I could see immediately why she fell for him. He had that kind of easy confidence that fills a room, the type that makes everyone around him feel like they're in the right place at the right time. I liked him at first. I want to be honest about that too. They dated for 2 years before he proposed. By then, Claire had left her marketing job and come to work with me at the company. Her idea, not mine, and she had turned out to be genuinely talented at the client-facing side of the business. She understood what clients needed before they could articulate it themselves. I used to tell her she had a gift for that. When they got engaged, Julian was still at the packaging company. He was making decent money but not exceptional money, and Claire had mentioned, more than once, that he was restless there. Felt like he had ceilinged out. When he asked if he could come work at the company, I said yes. Claire wanted it, and I believed at the time that Julian had the kind of sales instincts that could genuinely help us grow. I gave him the title of VP of Business Development. I gave him a salary that was more than fair, honestly. I helped him understand the industry, I brought him into client meetings and introduced him to relationships I had spent 17 years cultivating. I trusted him with things that I had not trusted anyone outside the family with before. What I did not do, and I have thought about this many times since, was make clear who owned what. Not because I was hiding anything. It simply never occurred to me that it needed to be said. This was my company. I had built it. Claire knew that. I assumed Julian understood it too. I was wrong about that assumption. More wrong than I could have guessed. Over the next 3 years, Julian was effective. He brought in 2 major new clients and expanded our relationship with the grocery chain into 3 additional regions. Revenue grew significantly. He was good at his job, and I told him so regularly. I promoted him to Chief Operating Officer when Claire and I agreed that the operational side needed more dedicated leadership so I could focus on longer-term strategy. That was my second mistake. I noticed the shift gradually, the way you notice a room getting darker before you realize the sun has gone down. Julian started referring to my team in meetings rather than the team. He started making operational decisions without looping me in and then explaining afterward rather than before. Small things, at first. The kind of things you can talk yourself out of taking seriously because the person doing them is family, and you don't want to be the kind of mother-in-law who creates problems. Claire didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't say so. She and Julian were happy, and I genuinely did not want to introduce friction into that happiness over what might be nothing more than a management-style difference. Then Claire got pregnant with their first child, and I watched Julian's behavior change in a way I can only describe as a man who has decided he has arrived somewhere. He started canceling our weekly check-ins. When I brought it up, he said he was managing things well and that the meetings weren't a good use of either of our time. When I reminded him that I was still the owner of the company and that those check-ins were not optional, he smiled and said of course, and then canceled the next one anyway. I should have acted then. I didn't. Claire was 7 months pregnant, and I told myself this wasn't the moment. The dinner was for Claire's 35th birthday. She had wanted something small, just family at the house, nothing elaborate. I had spent 2 days cooking because that's what I do for people I love. The house smelled like the pot roast Richard used to request every birthday, and I had put out the good tablecloth, the one my mother gave me, the one I only bring out for things that matter. Julian's mother Sylvia was there, which was fine. I had always gotten along reasonably well with Sylvia, even if we weren't close. Julian's younger brother was there with his girlfriend. And Claire, of course, radiant and enormous and happy. We were moving to the table when it happened. I had set the seat at the head of the table, Richard's old chair, the one I had always sat in since he passed, with my cardigan on the back of it. I always put my cardigan on the back of a chair at family dinners. I've done it since I was 30 years old. Julian walked over, picked up my cardigan, and handed it to me. Not unkindly, but with the casual certainty of someone who has already decided. He said, "Mom, would you mind sitting over there? I think it's better if the head of the table is, you know, the head of the household." He said it in front of everyone. Sylvia looked at her plate. Claire's face went through several expressions in about 2 seconds. Julian's brother suddenly found something fascinating about his water glass. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters, and I think it's the part that anyone who has been in a situation even remotely like this will understand immediately. It wasn't just humiliation, though it was that. It wasn't just anger, though it was that too. It was something deeper and stranger, a kind of vertigo, like the floor had shifted slightly under me, like the world had just quietly rearranged itself into a version I didn't recognize. I had built the house we were standing in. I had bought that chair. I had cooked the food on that table. I had employed the man who had just handed me my own cardigan like I was a guest in my own home. I stood there for a moment. Claire said, very quietly, "Julian," and he cut her off with a look. I sat in the other chair. I made that choice deliberately, not because I was accepting what he'd done, but because I knew with absolute clarity in that moment that I was not going to have this conversation in front of his mother and his brother on my daughter's birthday. I was not going to make Claire choose between her husband and her mother while she was 8 months pregnant, in front of an audience. I sat down. I ate the pot roast I had made. I listened to the conversation around the table, and I contributed to it normally. Because I am 63 years old and I have buried a husband and rebuilt a company from the edge of collapse, and I know how to hold myself together when it matters. But while I was sitting there, I was also thinking very clearly. After dinner, after Julian had helped clear the table, in the cheerful, expansive way of a man who felt very good about how the evening had gone, after Sylvia had hugged me goodbye and told me the pot roast was wonderful, after Claire had whispered to me at the door that she was sorry and I had told her that everything was fine, "Don't worry, go rest," I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I didn't drink. I was not going to blow up my daughter's life. That was not on the table. But I was also not going to allow what had happened to simply settle into the foundation of things, to become the new normal, to be the moment that established who had authority over what in that company. Because what Julian had done at that dinner table was not really about a chair. It was a signal. It was him telling everyone present, telling me how he saw the hierarchy now. I called my attorney the next morning, not to do anything dramatic, just to review the ownership structure, the employment agreements, and what protections existed and didn't exist. My attorney, who has known me for 15 years, listened and then said something I have thought about many times since. "Audrey, the problem isn't that he doesn't respect you. The problem is that he's made a calculation that he doesn't have to." That was exactly right. Over the following 3 weeks, I documented everything. Every decision Julian had made without authorization. Every contract he had signed that should have required my sign-off. Every communication where he had represented himself to clients or vendors as the decision-making authority at the company without qualification. I wasn't looking for a reason to fire him. I was building a picture of what had already happened because I needed to understand the full scope of it before I did anything. What I found was more extensive than I expected. Julian had been quietly repositioning himself in the company's external relationships for over a year. Not illegally, nothing I found crossed a legal line, but systematically. He had been the point of contact for our 2 largest clients. He had restructured the reporting relationships on the operations side so that every department head reported to him and only escalated to me if he decided it warranted it. He had, in effect, built a layer between me and my own company. He had done it gradually enough that it hadn't felt like a takeover while it was happening. But looking at it laid out on paper, that's exactly what it was. Claire had her baby, a boy, healthy and perfect, and I spent 3 days at the hospital and then at their house not thinking about any of this, just being a grandmother, which is the best thing I have ever been in my life. I held that baby and I thought about what I actually wanted, which was for Claire to be happy and for that child to grow up in a stable family, and for none of this to blow up in a way that couldn't be repaired. So I gave Julian one more chance to course correct on his own, even though he didn't know it was a chance. I called a meeting. Just the 2 of us. I sat across from him in my office in my building, and I told him directly that I had noticed some changes in how the company was being operated, that I wanted us to revisit the reporting structure, and that going forward all contracts above a certain threshold required my signature before execution without exception. He nodded. He said, "Of course, absolutely." He said he had just been trying to keep things moving efficiently, and he understood my concern. He was warm about it, reasonable. The version of Julian that Claire had fallen in love with. He didn't change a single thing. I found out 3 weeks later that he had told the operations team, in a meeting I was not in and was not told about, that I was stepping back and that he was taking on a broader leadership role. He used that phrase. Stepping back. About me. In my company. To my employees. That was the moment I made my decision. I spent the next 6 weeks working with my attorney and my accountant on a restructuring. What we put in place was straightforward and entirely within my rights as the sole owner of the company, a formal governance structure, clearly documented, that defined decision-making authority at every level. The COO role was redefined with explicit scope limitations. A new executive contract was drafted for Julian's position that included a 90-day performance review cycle and clear grounds for role adjustment. I also, quietly, began re-establishing direct relationships with every key client and vendor, not in a dramatic way, just personally reaching out, checking in, making sure they knew me and knew that I was the owner. Some of them seemed slightly surprised to hear from me directly, which told me something I hadn't wanted to know. I called a company-wide meeting on a Wednesday morning. Julian didn't know what it was about. I stood at the front of the room with my attorney present, and I walked through the new governance structure calmly and completely. I explained the reporting changes. I explained the contract requirements. I explained that effective immediately, the COO role would be adjusted, and that the adjustment would be detailed in a separate conversation with the person in that role. Julian sat in the third row and did not move his face. After the meeting, I asked him to come to my office. My attorney stayed in the room. I handed him the new employment agreement. I explained that the COO title was being retired and replaced with Director of Operations, a role with clearly defined scope, reporting directly to me, with a revised compensation structure that reflected the actual role rather than the one he had been informally expanding. I told him he was welcome to accept the new role and continue as a valued member of the team, or he could choose not to. He looked at the document for a long time. Then he said, "Claire is not going to be okay with this." I said, "I know you'll want to talk to Claire. I've already spoken with her." That part had been the hardest conversation of my life. Claire had cried. She had been angry at first. At me, not at Julian, which I had expected and prepared myself for. I told her what I had documented. I told her what Julian had said to the operations team about me stepping back. I told her that I was not asking her to take sides, that I was not trying to destroy her marriage, and that Julian's employment could continue in a role that made sense, but that I would not allow what had been happening to continue. I told her I needed her to understand that before anything else happened. She had called me back the next morning and said very quietly, "I believe you, Mom." Julian accepted the new role. He didn't have a lot of other options. He had a baby, a mortgage, and the packaging industry wasn't going to pay him what he'd been making with me. He accepted it, and he came to work the next Monday, and he did his job. But he also made it clear, in small ways, every day, that he had not accepted it inside himself. He was professional. He was cold. The easy warmth was gone, replaced by a careful, performative competence that fooled no one who knew him. 4 months later, he made one more mistake. He approached our largest client directly and attempted to negotiate a side arrangement, a consulting role for himself personally once he, as he apparently put it, moved on from the family business. The client, to their enormous credit, called me the same afternoon to let me know. I terminated his employment the next morning. The conversation was short. I told him what I knew. I told him that what he had done was a breach of his employment agreement, and potentially more than that. I told him that the severance I was offering was fair, but contingent on a non-compete and non-solicitation agreement, and that if he chose not to sign it, I was prepared to pursue the matter further. He signed. I want to tell you the thing I have thought about most in the months since, because I think it's the part that matters beyond the specific circumstances of what happened to me. I stayed at that dinner table. I sat down in the other chair. I ate the meal I had cooked, and I smiled, and I was gracious. And I know that there are people. I have read the comments on videos like this one, and I understand the reaction, who wonder why. Why not stand up and say something right then? Why not make it clear in that moment? Here's what I know after 63 years. The impulse to respond immediately, to demand acknowledgement of the wrong in the very moment it's being done, is understandable. But it almost never gets you what you actually want. What Julian wanted in that moment was a confrontation, a scene, something that would allow him to reframe what he'd done as a response to my reaction rather than a thing he had done unprovoked. I didn't give him that. I gave him silence, which he mistook for acceptance. And in that silence, I spent the next several months very quietly taking back everything I had ever given him. The company is doing well. My grandson is 8 months old now and has discovered that banging a wooden spoon against the tray of his high chair produces a deeply satisfying sound. Claire and I have lunch every Thursday. She and Julian are separated, though they are handling it carefully and without ugliness for the sake of their son, and I think they are both doing the best they can with a difficult situation. I did not set out to end my daughter's marriage. I want to be clear about that. I set out to reclaim something that was mine, not just the company, but my own standing in it, my own name, the work of my own hands. What followed from that was between Claire and Julian, and it was never in my hands to control. I think about Richard sometimes when I sit at the head of that table now. I think he would have had something dry and funny to say about all of it, the way he always did about the things that hurt the most. I think he would have told me I should have said something at the dinner table. He was always braver about confrontation than I was. But I also think he would have recognized what I built in those months after that birthday dinner. I think he would have looked at the documentation and the attorney and the governance structure and the phone call from the client, and he would have understood exactly what I had done and why. He built the company first. I kept it alive, and then I kept it mine. That's the whole story. And I am still here. I've been asked, more than once, why I didn't say something right then. Why I picked up my cardigan and sat in the other chair and ate the pot roast I had spent 2 days making, while the man who had taken everything I'd given him sat at the head of my table like he'd earned it. Here's the honest answer, because I've lived long enough to know the difference between the moment that feels like the right time to act and the moment that actually is. Julian made a calculation that night. He looked at me, a 63-year-old woman, his wife's mother, someone he had decided was soft enough to be moved. And he decided that the chair was his to take. What he didn't understand, what I don't think he ever really understood about me, is that the women who build things quietly are not quiet because they're weak. They're quiet because they're weak. They're quiet because they're working. I think about cause and effect a lot these days. Not in any mystical sense. I mean it plainly, the way a person means it when they've watched enough years go by to see patterns. What we do accumulates. The choices we make about how we treat people, about what we take that wasn't offered, about how we use trust that was extended to us in good faith. Those choices don't disappear. They compound. Julian spent 3 years quietly repositioning himself in my company, building a wall between me and my own employees, using relationships I had cultivated for 17 years as if they were his to use. He did it gradually enough that each individual step seemed almost reasonable. But the accumulation of it was a kind of theft, and eventually the bill for that comes due. The bill always comes due. That's not a threat or a philosophy. It's just what happens when you take credit for a foundation you didn't lay. What I want people to take from my story, especially the women who are watching this, who might be in something like what I was in, who have given so much to someone, and are now watching that person mistake their generosity for weakness, is this. Your patience is not the same thing as your permission. The fact that you have not yet responded does not mean you have accepted what was done. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a difficult moment is simply refuse to react on someone else's timeline. Save your clarity for when it counts. I also want to say something about the intelligence it takes to do what I did. I don't mean book intelligence. I mean the harder kind. The kind that requires you to see a situation clearly even when it's painful. To resist the urge to respond emotionally when a strategic response would serve you better, to build a case instead of making a scene. That kind of thinking is a skill. It can be developed, and it is worth more in the long run than any confrontation won in the moment. Claire and I have lunch every Thursday. Her son, my grandson, just learned to pull himself up on the coffee table and look enormously proud of himself about it. That part of my life is intact. That part of my life is, in fact, better than it has ever been. And I still sit at the head of the table.